Some men are just born to be lonely. It's a kind of loneliness that settles deep in the bones, a cold that a fireplace can't touch. That was Elias Boone, a giant walking the plains of Red Bluff, a man who could break a wild stallion with a whisper, but made children cry with just a look. His cabin was a hollow thing, filled with the sound of his own solitary footsteps on the floorboards. The silence was so loud, it was like a constant ringing in his ears. He ate cold beans from a can, night after night, the metal scraping against the tin a lonely kind of music. He was strong enough to build a ranch from nothing, but he couldn't build a life. Not a real one. The emptiness finally got to be too much. One day, he rode his horse into the dusty town of Red Bluff, hammered a nail into the post office board, and hung a small, handwritten note. The note was simple. It said, "Need a cook." That note was a lifeline for Clara May Sutton. She was a young widow, but grief had aged her. All she owned were a few worn-out dresses and a heart full of sorrow. The town whispered about her. Plain, they said. Past her prime, they whispered. But pride doesn't fill an empty stomach, and Clara needed that job more than she needed to listen to whispers. So she knocked on the giant's door. And in that moment, as the door creaked open, something inside both of them cracked. A little bit of light got in. This is the story of what happens when two broken souls, two people the world had thrown away, find out that love doesn't always show up in fancy clothes or with pretty words. Sometimes it shows up with a plate of hot biscuits and a quiet smile that can light up the darkest corners of a lonely life. What you're about to hear is a story of secrets, betrayal, and a love so powerful it could bring a whole town to its knees. So lean in close. You won't want to miss a single word. The paper was rough in Clara May Sutton's hands. It had been pinned to the post office board for 3 days, and for 3 days she'd walked past it, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. Finally, her desperation had won out over her fear. She'd torn it down, her fingers trembling. Need a cook, good pay, no trouble, ask for Elias Boone. The letters were blocky, careful, the writing of a man who wasn't used to putting words on paper. Everyone in Red Bluff knew the name Elias Boone, or they thought they did. He was a shadow on the edge of town, a man who stood a full head taller than anyone else, built like he was carved from an old oak tree. Men stepped out of his way on the street. Women pulled their children close. But Clara had seen things others missed. From the window of her lonely room at the boarding house, she'd watched him. She saw the way he gentled wild horses, his deep voice a low rumble that calmed the most frightened animal. She saw the way he tipped his hat to the preacher's wife, a small gesture of respect, even as the woman hurried across the street to avoid him. He wasn't a monster. She was sure of it. He was just alone. She knew what that felt like. The morning sun was turning the dust in the main street to gold as she walked. Her boots were worn thin. Her carpet bag held everything she owned in the world: 2 faded dresses, a handful of hairpins, and her mother's old cookbook. In her pocket, she could feel the cold, hard reality of her situation. $4.37. That was it. Mrs. Henderson, the owner of the boarding house, had made it painfully clear: pay the week's rent, or find somewhere else to sleep. Elias Boone's ranch was at the end of a long, winding dirt road. The place sprawled across a valley, with corrals and outbuildings that spoke of hard work. But even from a distance, Clara could feel the loneliness. It was in the air. No flowers bloomed by the door, no curtains hung in the windows. The porch sagged, like it was tired of holding up the weight of so much silence. She paused at the gate, her hand going to the simple bonnet covering her hair. She smoothed the front of her faded blue dress, a dress she had mended so many times it was more patch than fabric. The wind carried the smell of hay and horses, but underneath it was another smell. The smell of emptiness, the smell of a house that had forgotten the sound of laughter. What was she doing? Walking into the lion's den, the townspeople would say. A respectable widow, marching right up to the door of the town outcast. But what did she have to lose? Inside the cabin, Elias was moving with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who has done the same thing, in the same way, every single day, for years. He poured coffee into a tin cup, coffee so strong and black it could have stripped paint. He chewed on a cold, hard biscuit from yesterday, not even tasting it. He stared out the window at the empty land, at another empty day stretching out before him. The cabin was a testament to his isolation. One plate, one cup, one chair at the kitchen table. A narrow bed was pushed against the wall, the blanket pulled tight with military precision. The only thing that wasn't stark and bare was a single faded photograph on the mantelpiece. A man and a woman, their faces stern and unsmiling. His parents. He had built this place with his own 2 hands 15 years ago. He had dreamed of filling it with a family, a wife humming in the kitchen, the sound of children's feet running across the floorboards, the simple, ordinary things that turn 4 walls into a home. But the dream had died. Now, the only sounds were the tick-tock of the clock on the mantel and the heavy thud of his own boots on the floor. That's why the knock on the door was such a shock. It was a sound that didn't belong here. Visitors didn't come to this ranch. People in town would rather walk a mile out of their way than risk running into him. He set down his coffee, the tin cup making a sharp clink against the table. He walked to the door, his heart hammering in his chest. When he pulled it open, she was standing there. Clara May Sutton. She looked like a small, lost bird on his porch. Her dress was worn, but it was clean. Her dark hair had threads of silver in it, though she couldn't have been much older than 30. Grief did that to a person, but it was her eyes that stopped him. They were brown and soft, and they held a sadness that he recognized. It was the same sadness he saw in his own reflection in the window pane each morning. And she wasn't afraid. She was looking right at him, not at the giant, not at the monster from the town's whispers, but at the man. "Mr. Boone," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it was steady. "I saw your notice. I've come about the job." Elias just stared at her. He'd posted the notice out of a moment of sheer, crushing desperation, never really believing anyone would answer it, especially not her, the widow, the respectable Mrs. Sutton. He took in the determined set of her jaw, the way her hands gripped her carpet bag like it was the only thing holding her up. "You're the widow Sutton," he said. His voice was rough, rusty from not being used. "I am," she said, and lifted her chin a fraction of an inch. "And you need a cook." He should have sent her away, for her own good. A woman like her didn't belong in a place like this, with a man like him. But he couldn't. He stepped aside, a silent invitation. She walked into his kitchen. Her eyes swept over the room, taking in the bare walls, the single chair, the lonely tin cup. She saw everything. She saw the story of his life in one glance. When she turned back to him, there was a look on her face he couldn't quite read. It wasn't pity. He hated pity. It was something else, understanding. "Mr. Boone," she asked, her voice soft, "when was the last time you ate a hot meal?" The question hit him like a punch to the gut. He couldn't remember. He couldn't remember the last time someone had asked him a question that wasn't about a horse to be broken or a fence to be mended. He couldn't remember the last time someone had shown him a sliver of concern. "I get by," he grumbled. "That wasn't my question," she said. She put her bag down on the floor and walked right over to his pantry, pulling the door open. It was just as he knew it was. Rows and rows of canned beans, salted pork, and sacks of flour. Nothing fresh, nothing that spoke of a life being lived, only of a life being survived. "When did you last taste fresh-baked bread?" she pressed. "A stew that simmered on the stove all afternoon?" He had no answer. Food had stopped being a pleasure years ago. It was just fuel. Something to keep the machine of his body running. He'd forgotten it could be anything more. Clara turned from the pantry, and in that moment she made a decision. This man was drowning in loneliness, and he didn't even know it. Her own story was one of loss. Her husband, Thomas, had been taken by consumption the spring before. They had saved every penny for a little house, for a family. Then, all the pennies had gone to doctors who couldn't save him. She was left with nothing but a widow's pension that was an insult to the word. The town had been kind at first, casseroles and condolences, but sympathy has a shelf life. Soon the whispers started. She's so plain. She should try to find another husband. But how could she? Her heart was a closed-up house, the windows boarded over. But she knew how to cook. It was the one thing she had left. The one skill her mother had taught her that could save her now. "The job pays $15 a month," Elias said gruffly, watching her. "Plus a room and meals if you want it." $15 was a fortune. It was more than she could ever hope to make darning socks or cleaning other people's houses. "And my duties?" she asked, her gaze sharp. "Cook," he said, struggling with the words. "Clean up a bit. Just keep the place from falling in on me." He paused, and the next words came out in a rush, raw and honest. "I'm not looking for anything improper, Mrs. Sutton. I'm tired of my own cooking." She nodded. She heard what he wasn't saying. "I'm tired of being alone." "I'll need Sundays off," she said, testing him. "For church. Done. And I'll need to buy proper supplies, seasonings, fresh vegetables. Whatever you need." She walked to the window and looked out at the vast, empty land. It was beautiful, in a stark, unforgiving way. It was a land that didn't make false promises. It was honest. It felt like a place a person could start over, a place where the past might finally be buried. "I'll take the job, Mr. Boone," she said. The relief that washed over his face was so profound, so naked, that she had to look away. When was the last time this man had heard the word yes? "When can you start?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I can start now," she said. "I just need to get my things from the boarding house." "I'll take you." The offer hung in the air between them, a small, surprising gesture of kindness. He wasn't a man who made offers, and she wasn't a woman who was used to receiving them. As they rode into town on his wagon, the silence was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with unspoken questions, with the trembling possibility of something new. She snuck glances at the giant of a man beside her. His hands, which could break a man in two, were surprisingly gentle on the reins. The town gossips were in full force when they arrived at the boarding house. Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows shot up into her hairline when she saw Clara climbing down from Elias Boone's wagon. "Clara May! What in God's name are you doing?" the older woman hissed as Clara packed her meager belongings. "I've found a job, Mrs. Henderson." "A job? With him? That man is not right. A man his size, living all alone out there. He has a past, you know." "What past?" Clara asked, folding the photograph of her late husband carefully between her dresses. "A past of working hard and keeping to himself?" "They say he's dangerous," Mrs. Henderson whispered, her eyes wide. "They say he's hiding from something." Clara paused. For a second, a sliver of doubt crept in. Was she making a terrible mistake? Was she walking into a cage with a monster? But then she walked back outside. She saw Elias, waiting patiently by the wagon. He wasn't looking at the townspeople who were staring and whispering. He was looking at her, and in his eyes, she didn't see a monster. She saw a flicker of hope, and in that moment, she knew she had made the right choice. She climbed back into the wagon, her back straight, her chin held high. Let them whisper. Let them judge. Neither of them knew it then, but that crumpled job notice in Clara's bag wasn't just an offer of employment. It was the beginning of everything. It was the first step on a path that would lead them through secrets, danger, and betrayal. Because Elias Boone wasn't just a lonely rancher, and Clara May Sutton wasn't just a simple cook. They were two people with secrets, and their secrets were about to collide. Clara was up before the sun. The small room off the kitchen was simple, a narrow bed, a washstand, but it was clean, and it was hers. Around her neck, on a thin silver chain, hung her wedding ring. It felt heavy against her skin, a constant, cold reminder of the life she had lost, and a reminder of the guilt that pricked at her for feeling, for the first time in a long time, a flicker of something that wasn't grief. She lit the stove, the scrape of the match loud in the pre-dawn quiet. The kitchen felt different now. With her in it, it seemed to hold a breath of anticipation. She went about her work with a quiet reverence. Cooking for someone wasn't just about food. It was about warmth. It was about life. It was about chasing away the ghosts that lived in the corners of a silent house. She found eggs in the henhouse, still warm. There was fresh milk in a cool cellar he'd dug under the house. The man valued quality, even if he'd forgotten how to enjoy it. By the time the first blush of pink touched the horizon, the cabin was filled with smells it hadn't known in 15 years. The rich aroma of coffee that wasn't burnt to a crisp. The salty sizzle of bacon in a hot pan. The sweet yeasty promise of biscuits rising in the oven. Elias woke up to a world that didn't make sense. For a moment, just a moment, he thought he was dreaming. The smell of breakfast. The soft, rustling sounds of someone else moving through his house. He lay in his bed and let himself pretend. He pretended he was a normal man, a husband, waking up to the sound of his wife in the kitchen. The fantasy shattered as quickly as it had formed. This wasn't his wife. This was his employee, Clara May Sutton. She was here because she was desperate and he was lonely. That was the deal, nothing more. He dressed and walked into the kitchen, and the sight of her stopped him dead in the doorway. She was moving with a quiet, efficient grace, her small frame a whirlwind of purpose. She turned bacon, checked the biscuits, poured coffee, into 2 cups. 2. He hadn't seen 2 cups on his counter since his mother had died. "Good morning, Mr. Boone," she said without turning. "I hope you don't mind. I found the eggs. Your hens are good layers." "That's what they're for," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rougher than usual. The domesticity of the scene, the sheer, shocking normality of it, was shaking him to his core. She turned then, a plate in her hand. And there it was again. That look in her eyes. Not pity. It was something that felt dangerously like understanding, as if she could see right through the walls he'd spent a lifetime building. "Breakfast is ready," she said. They sat at the small kitchen table. Somehow she had found a second chair, dusted it off, and placed it opposite his. The meal was a revelation. The biscuits were so light they practically floated off the plate. The eggs were perfect. The bacon was crisp. But it wasn't the food that was undoing him. It was her, sitting across from him, eating with him, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "This is good," he said. The words felt small, inadequate. "My mother used to say the secret to good biscuits is a light hand," she replied, a small smile playing on her lips. "Don't fight the dough, just guide it." They ate. The only sounds were the clink of silverware and the ticking of the clock. But the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was comfortable. He found himself watching her when she wasn't looking. The way the morning light caught the silver in her hair, the way she held her fork, with a delicacy that seemed out of place in his rough-hewn cabin, the glint of the ring on the chain at her throat. "How long were you married?" The question came out of nowhere. He hadn't meant to ask it. Her hand flew to the ring, a gesture so reflexive he knew she did it 100 times a day. 6 years, she said. Thomas was a good man. She paused, then looked him straight in the eye. He was gentle, like you. The words stunned him. "I'm not gentle," he said, shaking his head. "Then the people in this town are blind," she said simply. "I saw you with that mare yesterday. The wild one. You could have broken her spirit, forced her into the stall, but you waited. You let her come to you." He didn't know what to say. He'd spent his life being feared. No one had ever looked at him and seen gentleness. No one had ever bothered to look that closely. She stood to clear the plates, and the moment was broken. "I think people and horses aren't so different," she said, her back to him as she worked at the sink. "They both need to know they can trust you before they'll let you get close." The words hung in the air. A warning? An invitation? He didn't know. "I'll be out in the north pasture today," he said, standing to leave. I won't be back for lunch. I'll pack you something, she said immediately. The casual kindness of it, the simple offer, it made his chest feel tight. He was almost out the door when her voice stopped him. Mr. Boone? He turned. Thank you, she said, for the job. I know what they say about me in town, that I'm plain, that I'm a burden. But you didn't seem to care about any of that. The words came out before he could stop them. Mrs. Sutton, he said, his voice low. I don't know what kind of fool would call you plain, but they're wrong. A faint blush colored her cheeks, and he realized he'd crossed a line. She was his employee, a respectable widow. He had no right to be saying such things. I've got work to do, he said gruffly, and practically fled from the cabin. But as he strode towards the barn, the cold morning air hitting his face, he could have sworn he heard something from the house, a sound he hadn't heard in 15 long years. It was the sound of a woman, humming softly as she worked. The day felt different. The solitude didn't press in on him like it usually did. As he worked, mending a fence under the vast blue sky, his thoughts kept drifting back to the cabin. To her. He found himself glancing towards the house, looking for the curl of smoke from the chimney. A sign of life. A sign that he wasn't completely alone in the world. When he returned for supper, the change was even more jarring. She'd found a tablecloth somewhere. She'd put a jar of wildflowers in the middle of the table. The stark, lonely room was starting to look like a home. You didn't have to, he said, his voice thick. A meal should be enjoyed, not just eaten, she replied, ladling a thick, fragrant stew into 2 bowls. 2 bowls. They talked more that evening. She told him about growing up on a farm, one of 7 children, where you learn to make something out of nothing. He found himself telling her about his early days, about the back-breaking work of building the ranch. Then he said something about a stubborn bull, and she laughed, a real, genuine laugh. The sound hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was like music, a forgotten melody from a life he'd never had, and in that moment, a terrifying realization dawned on him. He was in danger. He was in danger of wanting things he had no right to want. After supper, she shooed him away from the sink and insisted on cleaning up. He sat by the fire, a cup of coffee in his hands, watching her. The scene was so domestic, so normal. It felt like he was an actor in a play. This couldn't be his life. Mrs. Sutton, he said, his voice low. I need to be clear. This is a business arrangement. I wouldn't want you to be uncomfortable. She turned from the sink, her face lit by the flickering firelight. Her expression was impossible to read. I understand completely, Mr. Boone. But as she bid him good night and disappeared into her small room, he had the sinking feeling that neither of them understood anything at all, because as he sat there, in his warm, clean kitchen, filled with the lingering scent of stew and wildflowers, he knew one thing for certain. The note on the post office board hadn't just gotten him a cook. It had changed everything. In her room, Clara lay in the dark, her hand clutching the wedding ring on its chain. Her heart was a confused, fluttering thing in her chest. She was Thomas's widow. She was supposed to be in mourning. But when Elias had looked at her, when he'd called her anything but plain, her heart hadn't felt like it was in mourning at all. She was playing with fire. She knew it. But the cold had been so deep for so long, and for the first time in forever, she felt warm. Weeks turned into a month. The rhythm of their life settled into something that felt dangerously comfortable. Every morning, Elias would find his coffee waiting. Every evening, he would find a hot meal on the table. But it was more than that. The house wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was becoming a home. One afternoon, Clara was in the barn looking for some old sacks to use as rags. In the darkest, dustiest corner, hidden under a stiff canvas tarp, her foot hit something hard. Leather. Curious, she pulled the tarp away, and she gasped. It was a saddle, but it was unlike any saddle she had ever seen. The leather was dark and rich, covered in intricate hand-tooled patterns of roses and vines. The conchos were made of tarnished silver. The horn was worn smooth, as if 1,000 hands had held it. It was a masterpiece, a work of art. That was my father's. Elias's voice, coming from the shadows of the barn, made her jump. He walked into the light, his face a mask of old pain. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," she breathed, her hand tracing the tooling. "Why is it hidden away back here?" "Some things are better left buried," he said, his voice flat. But Clara was learning to read him. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes went distant. She'd seen that look before, in her own mirror. "He must have been a great horseman," she said softly, not pushing. Elias came closer, his large frame blocking the light from the door. "The best in the territory," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "They said he could talk to horses, that he could gentle any creature, no matter how broken." The words hung in the air. Broken. Clara waited. She knew this was a door he rarely opened. "I was 12 when he left," Elias said, his eyes fixed on the saddle. "One morning I came out to the barn to do my chores and he was just gone. His horse, his gear, everything. Except this." He touched the saddle horn, his finger tracing the worn leather. "He left this on my bed, with a note. It said I'd grow into it one day." Clara's heart ached for the little boy he must have been. The boy who woke up to find his entire world had vanished. "And did you?" she asked gently. He shook his head, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "Never used it. Couldn't bring myself to. Putting it on a horse, it would have felt like admitting he was really gone, that he wasn't ever coming back." The vulnerability in his voice was a crack in the armor he wore so carefully. This was the source of his loneliness. This was the wound that had never healed. A boy, abandoned by the one person he was supposed to be able to count on. "Maybe," she said, choosing her words with care. "Maybe he left it for you because he knew you wouldn't need it. Maybe he knew you'd become the kind of man who didn't need to ride a fancy saddle to prove his worth." He looked at her then. Really looked at her. As if he was seeing something he'd never seen before. "How do you do that?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Do what?" "Find the good in something that's broken." She gave him a small, sad smile. Her hand was still resting on the saddle. "Practice," she said softly. "I've had a lot of practice with broken things." Their unspoken connection was growing stronger every day. It was in the small things. The way he started leaving a bucket of fresh water on the porch for her every morning. The way she started baking an extra loaf of bread on Saturdays, because she knew he'd like to have it with his coffee on Sunday mornings. The town noticed, of course. Red Bluff was a town built on whispers. And the sight of Clara May Sutton driving Elias Boone's wagon to the general store for supplies was enough to fuel the gossip mill for a week. "It ain't decent," Mrs. Henderson declared to anyone who would listen at the post office. "A respectable widow shacked up with that giant. No good will come of it. Mark my words." But Clara didn't care. For the first time since Thomas died, she felt a sense of purpose. She was needed. This lonely, broken man, he needed her. And maybe, just maybe, she needed him too. The change in Elias was quiet, but profound. He started talking more. He'd tell her stories about the ranch, about a coyote that was getting too bold, or a calf that had been born that morning. He started bringing her things, a wildflower he'd picked from the high pasture, a hawk's feather, a strangely shaped rock from the creek bed. Small, simple gifts that told her he was thinking of her, even when they were apart. One evening, as she was preparing supper, she started humming. An old hymn her mother used to sing. She didn't even realize she was doing it until she turned from the stove and saw him standing in the doorway. His hat was in his hands, and he was watching her with an expression of such raw longing that it made her breath catch. "Don't stop," he said, his voice thick. "Please." She fell silent, her cheeks flushing. I didn't realize." "My mother," he said, taking a step into the room. She used to hum that same song in the kitchen before he didn't finish. He didn't have to. Before she got sick. Before she died. Before I was left all alone. The silence in the room was heavy with unspoken grief. He was a man drowning in a sea of loss, and she was the first person to throw him a rope. "It's called In the Sweet By and By," she said softly. "It's about hope, about believing in a better day." He just nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. In that moment, something shifted. The careful, fragile line between employer and employee, between two lonely strangers, it dissolved. "Clara," he said. It was the first time he'd used her given name. The sound of it, in his deep voice, sent a shiver down her spine. "Thank you for bringing music back into this house." The words were simple, but they meant everything. That night, she lay in her bed, her hand clutching the ring on its chain. "Thomas would want me to be happy," she told herself. But was this happiness? Or was it just a different kind of loneliness, a shared one? She didn't know, but she knew that Elias Boone was more than just a giant. He was a man with a broken heart. And she was beginning to realize that the most dangerous thing in the world was the desire to try and fix him. Because a closer look at the beautiful saddle revealed something else, something hidden. Tucked deep into a seam, almost invisible, was a small, folded piece of oilcloth. And inside it wasn't a note. It was a map. And Clara had a terrible feeling that she knew exactly what it led to. She hadn't come to Red Bluff for a job. She'd come for that map. And Elias Boone was standing right in her way. The recipe book was Clara's last link to her old life. The pages were yellowed and soft, stained with the ghosts of meals she had made for Thomas. His favorite apple pie, the honey cake she'd baked for their first anniversary. Each recipe was a memory. Each stain, a tiny tombstone for a life that was gone. But now, sitting in Elias Boone's quiet kitchen, a new kind of notation was appearing in the margins. Elias's favorite biscuits, extra butter, a touch of honey. It was a small act of rebellion. A declaration that she was still alive, that a new chapter was being written, whether she was ready for it or not. But the secrets she carried felt heavier than any cast-iron skillet. The map, tucked away in her room, was a constant, burning reminder of why she was really here. It wasn't about biscuits. It wasn't about kindness. It was about justice. It was about a debt that had to be paid. Her father had been Elias Boone's father's partner. They had discovered something on this land, something incredibly valuable, something that had gotten her father killed, and Elias's father vanished. She'd been just a girl, but she remembered the hushed, terrified whispers. She remembered her mother, weeping over a letter that had arrived in the dead of night. A letter that came with a map and a desperate plea to keep it safe until the time was right. The job notice for a cook had been a signal, a coded message she had been waiting for her entire adult life. It meant Elias, the boy who had been left behind, was still here. It meant the secret was still safe. But the man she had found was not the partner she had expected. He was a wounded animal, a man who trusted no one. How could she tell him the truth? How could she tell him his whole life had been a lie? That his father hadn't abandoned him, but had been trying to protect him? And how could she do it when this charade, this simple life of cooking and cleaning, was starting to feel more real than the mission she had sworn to complete? She was falling for the man she was supposed to be using. The first hint of real trouble arrived on a Tuesday morning in the form of 3 self-righteous hens from town. Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house owner, led the charge. Beside her were Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, and Mrs. Cole from the general store. They stood at the gate like a panel of judges, their faces pinched with disapproval. Clara met them on the porch, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. "Ladies," she said, her voice cool, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" "Clara May," Mrs. Henderson began, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "We've come out of concern for your reputation. My reputation is my own business." "Is it?" sniffed Mrs. Patterson. The whole town is talking. A decent widow, living alone with a man like that. It isn't proper. What isn't proper, Clara said, her voice sharp, is judging a man you don't even know. Oh, we know him, hissed Mrs. Cole. We know he's strange, unnatural. A man that size with that temper. There are stories. There are always stories, Clara shot back. Usually told by people with too much time on their hands and not enough kindness in their hearts. The women exchanged smug, knowing glances. We're only trying to help you, dear, Mrs. Henderson said, her smile like a razor blade. We've even found you a new position, a respectable one. A family in Denver needs a governess. It was a threat, wrapped in a pretty bow. Leave or we will make your life a living hell. But it was more than that. Clara saw it in Mrs. Henderson's eyes. This wasn't just town gossip. This was a message from someone else, someone who wanted her gone. I have a respectable job right here, Clara said, her voice deadly quiet. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have biscuits in the oven. I suggest you leave. As they retreated in a flurry of indignant feathers, she heard Mrs. Cole's stage whisper. She'll regret it. When his true colors show, she'll come running. Clara stood on the porch, her hands shaking, not with fear but with rage. They hadn't come to save her reputation. They had come to drive her away. When Elias came in from the fields, he found her staring at the wall, her face pale. He must have seen the women leave because his first words were a low growl. I'm sorry, he said, his voice rough with shame. I should have known this would happen. I've brought trouble to your door. Don't you dare apologize for them, she snapped, whirling to face him. Their small minds are not your fault. He just looked at her, his eyes filled with a kind of bewildered wonder. You defended me. Of course I defended you. You're a good man, Elias Boone. The words were out before she could stop them, and they hung in the air, a dangerous, beautiful truth. She had said it. She had admitted it, to him and to herself. He took a step closer. The space between them crackled with unspoken energy. Clara, he began, his voice barely a whisper. But she couldn't. Not yet. The secrets she held were a wall between them. I should check the stew, she stammered, turning away. But she felt his hand on her arm, his touch gentle but firm. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. For seeing something in me that I stopped seeing in myself a long time ago. That night, the guilt was a bitter taste in her mouth. She was lying to him. Every meal she cooked, every kind word she spoke, was part of a deception. She was using his loneliness, his trust, to get what she wanted. But what did she want anymore? Justice for her father? Or the quiet comfort of this broken man's company? The answer terrified her. The fence post in the south pasture was broken, leaning like a drunken soldier. Clara had found it on one of her afternoon walks she took to clear her head, to try and untangle the knot of lies and feelings in her chest. The broken fence felt like a symbol of her own life, a boundary that was about to give way. That's been needing a fix for a month, Elias said, coming up behind her on his horse. The sight of him, silhouetted against the setting sun, still made her heart skip a beat. It was infuriating. She was supposed to be a woman on a mission, cold and calculating. But every time he looked at her with those sad, gentle eyes, her resolve melted like butter in a hot skillet. I can help, she said, the words surprising them both. He dismounted, a skeptical look on his face. This is hard work, Clara. Dirty work. I grew up on a farm, Elias, she said, a challenge in her voice. I'm not afraid of dirt, and I'm stronger than I look. A slow smile spread across his face. It was a rare sight, and it transformed him. I don't doubt that for a second, he said. They worked together as the sun bled across the sky. There was a simple, easy rhythm to their movements. She held the new post steady while he drove it into the hard earth with his sledgehammer, the muscles in his back and shoulders bunching with each powerful swing. She stretched the wire, her small hands surprisingly strong, while he secured it. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. In the shared work, in the simple act of building something together, A new kind of understanding was growing between them. Thomas and I, we mended a lot of fences, she said, her voice soft. It was the first time she'd spoken his name without a sharp pang of grief. Now it was just a memory, a fact. He was a good man, Elias said, not a question but a statement. He was, she agreed. But he was different from you. He was easy. He laughed all the time. He made friends everywhere. She looked up at Elias, at his serious, weathered face. You're like a deep river, Elias, quiet on the surface, but there's a lot going on underneath. They finished as the first stars pricked the purple sky. Their hands brushed as they gathered the tools. The touch was electric, a jolt of lightning in the twilight. They walked back to the cabin in silence, the air between them thick with things unsaid. At the porch, she turned to face him. Elias, she began, but the words caught in her throat. Clara, he said, his voice a low rumble. He took a step closer, then another. He was so close now she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. I think, he said, his voice rough with emotion, I think I'm falling in love with you. The words were a hammer blow to her carefully constructed walls. They shattered her mission, her secrets, her guilt. All that was left was the raw, terrifying truth. I think, she whispered, her voice trembling, I already have. And then he kissed her. It wasn't a rough kiss. It was impossibly gentle. It was hesitant, questioning. The kiss of a man who couldn't believe his good fortune. Her hands came up to rest on his chest, and she could feel his heart hammering, a frantic, wild rhythm that matched her own. It was a kiss that tasted of dust and sweat and loneliness and a desperate, blooming hope. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. She rested her forehead against his chest, her world tilting on its axis. Everything was different now. The lies, the map, the mission. It all seemed to fade away. All that mattered was the solid feel of him under her hands, the steady beat of his heart. What does this mean? She whispered into his shirt. I don't know, he admitted, his arms tightening around her, as if he was afraid she might vanish. I just know that I'm not letting you go. That night, she took the map from its hiding place. She looked at the faded lines, the cryptic symbols. This was her father's legacy, her duty. But her own heart was a traitor. She went to the main room. Elias was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, his face a mixture of wonder and fear. She walked up behind him and placed the oilcloth map on the table in front of him. Elias, she said, her voice shaking. We need to talk. My name is Clara May Sutton, but I am not a cook. The air in the cabin grew thick and cold. Elias stared at the map on the table, then slowly lifted his gaze to Clara's face. The warmth that had been in his eyes just hours before was gone, replaced by a guarded, shuttered look she recognized all too well. It was the look of a man who had been betrayed before, and had been expecting it to happen again. What is this? He asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He didn't touch the map. He looked at it like it was a coiled snake. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the moment of truth. She could lose everything right now. It's the reason I came to Red Bluff, she said, her own voice barely a whisper. My father was Daniel Sutton. He was your father's partner. Elias's face went rigid. A muscle jumped in his jaw. My father didn't have a partner. Yes, he did, she insisted, her voice gaining strength. They found something on this land, Elias. Something valuable. Your father, James, he wrote to my father just before he disappeared. He said they were in danger. He sent this map. She unfolded the oilcloth with trembling fingers. The lines were drawn in faded ink, showing the familiar contours of the valley, but with strange symbols and notations that made no sense. In the corner was a single cryptic phrase, where the shadow falls at noon on the shortest day. Elias stared at it, his expression unreadable. My father abandoned me, he said, the words flat and hard, like stones. He took his horse and his gear. and he left me with nothing but a fancy saddle I couldn't use." "No!" Clara cried, taking a step closer. "That's the story you were meant to believe. It was a lie to protect you. He didn't abandon you, Elias. He was trying to keep you safe from the same people who killed my father." The confession hung in the air, heavy and terrible. Elias stood up, his massive frame seeming to fill the entire cabin. He began to pace, his heavy boots thudding on the floorboards, the sound like a drumbeat of doom. "Killed?" he repeated, his voice choked. "He was found on the road to Denver," Clara said, tears welling in her eyes. "They said it was a robbery, but my mother always knew. It was because of what they'd found, and she knew they would come for your father next." Elias stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes blazing with a mixture of grief and fury. "And you? You've been here for months, cooking my meals, living in my house, and you never said a word? You let me believe." "I didn't know how to tell you," she defended herself. "I came here to find the man from the stories my mother told, a partner to help me find justice. But I found you, a man who was so wounded, so alone. I didn't know how to add this to your burden. And then you kissed me," he finished, his voice laced with bitterness. "Was that part of the plan too? Seduce the lonely giant to get him to trust you?" The accusation was a knife in her heart. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That was the one thing that wasn't part of the plan. That's what ruined the plan." He stared at her, a war raging in his eyes. He wanted to believe her. She could see it. But 15 years of loneliness had taught him that trust was a fool's game. Before he could speak, a new sound shattered the tense silence. The sound of horses, fast horses, approaching the cabin. Elias moved to the window, his body instantly tense. He peered through the glass into the moonlit yard. "It's Crane," he hissed. "Jeremiah Crane and his men." Clara's blood ran cold. Jeremiah Crane was the cattle baron who was trying to buy up the entire valley. He'd made Elias a ridiculously low offer for the ranch just weeks ago, an offer Elias had flatly refused. "What does he want at this hour?" she breathed. "Nothing good," Elias said grimly. He turned from the window, his eyes falling on the map on the table. In a flash, he seemed to understand. "He knows," he said. "He doesn't want the land for grazing. He knows what's under it." The knocking on the door was loud and impatient. It wasn't a request. It was a demand. Elias looked at Clara. The betrayal was still in his eyes, but something else was there too. A grim, protective instinct. He was still angry with her, but Crane was the enemy. "Get in your room," he ordered, "and lock the door. Don't come out, no matter what you hear." "Elias, no. Do it!" he roared, and the force of his voice sent a shockwave through the small cabin. Terrified, Clara scurried into her room and slid the bolt across the door. She pressed her ear against the wood, her body trembling. She heard Elias open the main door. She heard Crane's smooth, oily voice. "Boone, a little late for a social call, I know, but we have business to discuss." "My answer is still no, Crane." Elias's voice was a low growl. "Oh, I think you'll reconsider," Crane said, and his voice held a chilling amusement. "You see, I have a new partner, someone who knows this land almost as well as you do, someone who knows all your little secrets." There was a pause. Then another voice, a woman's voice, sharp and familiar. "Hello, Elias. It's been a long time." Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She knew that voice. She had heard it just that morning, dripping with fake concern. It was Mrs. Henderson. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Crane's voice cut through the night. "A map. I'll give you one chance. Hand it over, and I'll let you and your little cook walk away from here with your lives." Clara's mind raced. Mrs. Henderson, the town gossip, was working with Crane. She must have been his eyes and ears in town, reporting on everything. She must have known who Clara was all along. Her visit that morning wasn't a warning. It was reconnaissance. "I don't know what you're talking about," Elias said, his voice steady. "Don't play dumb with me, Boone," Crane snarled. I know Sutton's daughter came here. I know she has the map. We can do this the easy way, or we can do this the hard way. The hard way involves burning this pathetic little shack to the ground with both of you inside." Clara's breath hitched. This was it. This was how her father had died. Not a robbery, an execution, and now they were here to finish the job. She heard the sound of a scuffle, a heavy thud, a grunt of pain from Elias. "Find it!" Crane shouted. Clara scrambled away from the door, her eyes darting around her small room. The map. Elias had left it on the table. They would find it. But her eyes landed on the old recipe book sitting on her nightstand. The book with her mother's handwriting, and her own. An idea, desperate and crazy, sparked in her mind. She heard them ransacking the main room, overturning the table, smashing the single chair. "It's not here!" one of Crane's men shouted. "Check the woman's room!" Crane ordered. The handle on her door rattled violently. Then, the heavy thud of a boot kicking the wood. The lock splintered. The door flew open. One of Crane's thugs stood there, a brutish man with a cruel sneer on his face. He saw her, cowering in the corner, and his eyes lit up. "Well, well, what have we here?" But Clara wasn't cowering. She was waiting. As he stepped into the room, she swung the heavy cast-iron skillet she had grabbed from her own small stove. She put every ounce of her fear and rage into the blow. It connected with the side of his head, with a sickening crack. The man's eyes rolled back in his head, and he crumpled to the floor in a heap. Clara didn't hesitate. She ran past him, out into the chaotic main room. Crane was standing over Elias, who was on one knee, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. Mrs. Henderson was holding a lantern, her face a mask of greedy triumph. "The map, girl!" Crane demanded, turning to her. "Give it to me now!" Clara held up the old recipe book. "Looking for this?" She bluffed, her voice shaking but defiant. Crane's eyes narrowed. "Don't be a fool. That's a cookbook." "Is it?" she said, her mind racing. "Or is it a clever code? Recipes for disaster, perhaps? Your father's special recipe for getting rid of business partners?" The shot in the dark hit its mark. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Crane's face. He knew his father's history. In that split second of hesitation, Elias exploded into action. He surged to his feet with a roar of pure fury, tackling Crane like a maddened bear. The two men crashed to the floor. Clara didn't wait to see the outcome. She ran. She burst out of the cabin door and into the cold night air, the recipe book clutched to her chest. She had to get away. She had to lead them away from Elias. But as she ran towards the dark outline of the barn, she felt a searing pain in her shoulder. The world tilted sideways. The ground rushed up to meet her. The last thing she heard before darkness took her was Mrs. Henderson's shrill voice, shouting in triumph, "She's hit! We've got her!" Clara woke to the smell of hay and horse manure. Her head was pounding and a sharp, throbbing pain radiated from her shoulder. She tried to move, but her hands were bound tightly behind her back. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She was in the barn. The dim light of a single lantern cast long, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Jeremiah Crane was standing over her, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. Mrs. Henderson was beside him, clutching the recipe book. "Witty," Crane said, tapping the book with his finger. "Using a cookbook as a decoy. But the real map wasn't in there, was it, little bird?" His men were tearing the cabin apart, their shadows moving frantically outside the barn door. "You won't find it," Clara spat, her voice raspy. Crane laughed, a low, ugly sound. "Oh, I think we will. But first, let's talk about your partner." He gestured with his head, and one of his men dragged Elias into the barn. He was bruised and bloody, his hands also bound, but his eyes, when they met Clara's, were blazing with a defiant fire. "Let her go, Crane," Elias growled. "This is between you and me." "Everything in good time," Crane said smoothly. He turned his attention back to Clara. "Now where is it? My father searched for that map for 20 years. He knew your father and his had found the mother lode, a vein of silver so rich it would make a man a king. But they were greedy. They wouldn't share. They wouldn't let your father murder and steal his way to a fortune, Clara corrected him. Crane's smile tightened. Semantics. The point is, I am not my father. I will not fail. Now for the last time, where is the map? When she didn't answer, he nodded to one of his men. The man backhanded Elias across the face, the sound a sharp crack in the quiet barn. "Stop it!" Clara screamed. "Tell me!" Crane insisted. "I don't have it!" she cried, a tear of frustration and pain tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. "I don't know where it is!" It was a lie, but a necessary one. Before she had confronted Elias, she had taken the real map and hidden it. She'd known, with a chilling certainty, that things were about to get dangerous. She'd slipped it inside the lining of the one thing she knew no one would ever touch. The old, forgotten saddle. Her father's saddle, which he had given to Elias's father as a gift. The one Elias couldn't bear to look at. Crane studied her face, his eyes cold and calculating. "You're a terrible liar," he said softly. "But no matter. We'll find it, and once we do—" He let the threat hang in the air. He turned to Mrs. Henderson. "Watch them. If they so much as breathe wrong, you know what to do." He and his men left the barn, resuming their frantic search of the cabin. For a long moment, the only sound was the nervous stamp of a horse in a nearby stall. Elias was slumped against a post, his head down. Clara's heart broke for him. This was all her fault. Her lies, her secrets, had brought this nightmare to their door. "Elias," she whispered, "I'm so sorry." He lifted his head and his eyes were surprisingly clear. "It's not your fault, Clara," he said, his voice low. "It's mine. I was a fool. I spent 15 years feeling sorry for myself, believing my father was a coward. He was a hero. He was protecting me. We're going to die in here, aren't we?" she said, the words a stark, cold fact. "No," he said, and there was a sudden, fierce intensity in his voice. He started straining against his ropes, the muscles in his arms and back bunching. The thick rope groaned under the pressure. Mrs. Henderson, who had been watching them with a smug look, now looked nervous. "Stop that!" she snapped, raising the pistol Crane had left with her. "Stop it, or I'll shoot!" "You don't have the guts, Martha," Elias growled, the name from a shared childhood they had both forgotten. The ropes were starting to fray. Just then, one of Crane's men appeared at the barn door. "Boss, we found something! In the old saddle!" Mrs. Henderson's face lit up with greedy triumph. She turned her head for just a second, distracted by the news. It was the opening Elias needed. With a final explosive roar of effort, the rope snapped. He moved faster than Clara had ever seen him move. In 2 massive strides, he crossed the barn and slammed into Mrs. Henderson. The gun went flying. He didn't stop. He grabbed a pitchfork from the wall and charged out of the barn, a primal scream of rage tearing from his throat. Clara heard shouts of surprise and pain from outside. She scrambled over to the wall where Elias had been tied and began sawing her own ropes against the jagged edge of a broken board. The ropes finally gave way. She ran to the barn door and peered out. It was chaos. Elias was a whirlwind of destruction, the pitchfork a deadly extension of his arms. Crane's men, caught completely by surprise, were falling back. But Crane himself was there, a pistol in his hand, taking aim at Elias's back. "Elias, look out!" she screamed. He spun around just as Crane fired. The bullet, meant for his heart, tore through the fleshy part of his arm. He staggered, but he didn't fall. Clara looked around frantically. Her eyes landed on the lantern Mrs. Henderson had dropped. An idea, terrible and desperate, formed in her mind. The barn was filled with dry hay. It was a tinderbox. She grabbed the lantern and smashed it on the ground. Flames erupted, licking instantly up the dry wooden walls. "Fire!" she shrieked at the top of her lungs. "Fire!" The distraction worked. Crane and his men turned, their faces horrified, as they saw the barn being consumed by a roaring inferno. In that moment of confusion, Elias charged again, ignoring the pain in his arm. He slammed into Crane, and the two men went down in a tangle of limbs. Clara didn't wait. She ran. She ran away from the burning barn, away from the fight, towards the dark, open plains. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she had to get the map. The man who had found it in the saddle was running towards the fight, the precious oilcloth in his hand. Clara tackled him from the side, a flying leap of pure desperation. They both went down hard. She clawed at his hand, her fingers finding the map. She wrenched it free and scrambled to her feet. She ran into the darkness, the sounds of the fight and the roar of the fire fading behind her. The map was clutched in her hand, but her relief was short-lived. Headlights, a wagon coming up the road, fast. She froze, caught in the beams like a terrified deer. The wagon screeched to a halt, and a man jumped down. It wasn't one of Crane's men. It was the town sheriff, his face grim in the flickering light of the burning barn. And sitting next to him on the wagon seat was a man Clara had never seen before, a man in a city suit with cold, intelligent eyes. "Clara May Sutton?" the stranger asked, his voice calm and authoritative. "I'm Marshal Davies. We've been looking for you." Clara stared at him, confused. She looked back at the ranch. The fire had engulfed the barn completely now, casting an apocalyptic glow over the scene. She could see the sheriff's men, deputies she recognized from town, swarming the area, overpowering what was left of Crane's thugs. She saw Elias, standing tall, his face bloody but triumphant, Crane at his feet. The nightmare was over, but a new confusion was just beginning. You were looking for me?" she stammered. "We were," Marshal Davies said. He gestured to the map in her hand. "And for that. We had an informant, someone who told us Crane was finally making his move tonight." Clara's mind reeled. An informant? Who? "Who told you?" she asked. The marshal's lips quirked in a small smile. A man who knew this was coming. A man who wanted to make sure his son would be safe when it all went down. He stepped aside, and from the shadows behind the wagon, another figure emerged. An older man, his face weathered and scarred, but with eyes that were achingly familiar. He was missing an arm, and he walked with a heavy limp. He looked at Clara, and his face broke into a sad, gentle smile. Clara stared, her heart stopping in her chest. She had seen that face before, in the old, faded photograph on Elias's mantelpiece. It was James Boone, Elias's father. He wasn't dead. He wasn't a ghost. He was standing right in front of her. The world tilted, and Clara had to grab the side of the wagon to keep from falling. Elias's father was alive. The man who had supposedly abandoned his son 15 years ago was here, working with a federal marshal. Nothing made sense. "You," she stammered, looking at James Boone. "But how?" "It's a long story, miss," James said, his voice raspy from disuse. "One I should have told my boy a long time ago." His eyes, so much like Elias's, were filled with a deep, bottomless sorrow as he looked past her at the burning barn and the silhouette of his son. Just then, Elias, flanked by the sheriff and his deputies, was walking towards them. Crane and his men, including a sputtering Mrs. Henderson, were being led away in chains. Elias's arm was in a makeshift sling, his face was a mess of cuts and bruises, but he walked like a king. Then he saw the man standing by the wagon. He stopped dead in his tracks. His face, which had been set in a grim mask of victory, crumpled. Disbelief, then anger, then a profound, heart-wrenching pain washed over his features. "Father?" he whispered, the word a choked, broken thing. "Hello, son," James said, taking a hesitant step forward. Elias didn't move. He just stared, his whole body trembling. "You're alive," he said, his voice flat. "All this time, I thought you were dead, or a coward who ran away." "I know," James said, his voice thick with regret. "I let you believe that. It was the only way I could keep you safe." Marshal Davies stepped forward. "Your father has been our key witness against the Crane family for over a decade, son. He faked his own death after they tried to kill him, just like they killed Daniel Sutton. He's been living under our protection, feeding us information, waiting for the day we could finally build a case strong enough to bring Jeremiah and his whole corrupt enterprise down. The pieces of the puzzle started to click into place in Clara's mind. The reason the law had shown up at the perfect moment. The informant. It had been James Boone all along, watching over his son from the shadows, a ghost protecting his legacy. The silver vein was just the beginning, Davies continued. The Cranes have been using their mining operations as a front for a massive criminal network. Land fraud, smuggling, murder. Your fathers, Mr. Boone and Mr. Sutton, they stumbled onto the truth, and it cost one of them his life and the other, his family. Elias still hadn't moved. He was looking at his father as if he were an apparition. "You left me," he said, the words of the 12-year-old boy raw and wounded. "You left me alone." "I never left you," James said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Not a day went by I didn't think of you. Not a day I didn't regret what I had to do. But they would have killed you, son. Crane's father, he was a monster. I had to disappear. I had to become a ghost. It was the only way to ensure that one day you would get back what was rightfully yours." He gestured to the land around them. All of this. He then turned his gaze to Clara. "And I owe you a debt I can never repay, miss. Your mother honored your father's promise. She kept the map safe. And you had the courage to bring it here. You brought the truth back into the light." Clara looked at the map in her hand. The cryptic clue, where the shadow falls at noon on the shortest day. It wasn't just a map to a silver mine. It was a key to unlocking this whole conspiracy. "There's more," Clara said suddenly, her eyes lighting up with understanding. "The map doesn't just show the location of the mine. The clue? It's not about a place. It's about a time." She looked at Marshal Davies. "The shortest day of the year, the winter solstice, that's next week. What happens then?" Davies and James exchanged a look. "The final piece of the puzzle," Davies said grimly. "Your fathers were clever. They knew they couldn't go to the law because the Cranes owned the law back then. So they created their own insurance policy, a hidden ledger. It details every crime, every bribe, every murder the Crane family ever committed. The map shows the location of the mine, but the mine is where the ledger is hidden. The clue tells us when we can get to it." "Why only on the solstice?" Elias asked, finally finding his voice. "It's hidden in a chamber that's only accessible for a few hours on that one day," James explained. "A natural phenomenon. The sun hits a vein of quartz in the rock at just the right angle, illuminating a hidden entrance that's otherwise flooded and invisible. They designed it so that only someone with the map and the clue could ever find it. It was brilliant, a secret, locked away by nature itself." Suddenly, a new chilling thought struck Clara. Crane was being led away, but he had a strange, smug smile on his face. He didn't look like a defeated man. He looked like a man who had another card to play. "Marshal," she said urgently, "Crane might be arrested, but he still has people out there. What if he knows about the ledger? What if he sends someone to get it before you do?" The marshal's face hardened. "He doesn't know the exact location. Without the map, he's blind." But Clara wasn't so sure. Mrs. Henderson had been his informant for years. What else might she have told him? What other secrets had she gleaned from the town's whispers? As if on cue, a commotion broke out near the wagons where the prisoners were being held. One of the deputies shouted, "He's gone! Crane is gone!" In the chaos of the fire and the arrests, one of Crane's men who had evaded capture had created a diversion, and Crane had slipped away into the darkness. The triumphant atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a cold dread. "He's going for the ledger," Elias said, his voice grim. "He may not have the map, but he knows the general area. He'll tear that mountain apart to find it." "We have to get there first," Clara said, her voice filled with a new, steely resolve. The fire from the burning barn cast a hellish glow on their faces. The family reunion was over. The battle had been won. But the war for the truth, for the legacy of their fathers, was just beginning. And it was a race against time. A race to a secret hidden in the heart of a mountain. a secret that would only reveal itself on the shortest day of the year. The journey into the mountains was a desperate, silent race. Elias, his father James, Clara, and Marshall Davies rode hard, the precious map clutched in Clara's hand. The winter air was sharp and cold, biting at their faces. Every gust of wind sounded like Crane's men closing in. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Elias and his father rode side by side, the 15 years of silence between them a chasm that was only now beginning to be bridged. There were 1,000 questions Elias wanted to ask, 1,000 accusations he wanted to hurl, but there was no time. All that mattered was the mission. "He'll go to the old northern mine shaft," James said, his voice a low growl over the sound of the horse's hooves. "It's the closest access point to the area on the map. He'll use dynamite. He'll bring the whole mountain down if he has to." "We'll get there first," Elias said, his jaw set. He glanced at Clara, riding beside him. Her face was pale with exhaustion, her shoulder was bandaged beneath her coat, but her eyes were bright with a fierce determination. The sight of her, so small yet so strong, filled him with a wave of protective love so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He had almost lost her. He would not fail her now. They reached the foothills as dawn broke, painting the snow-dusted peaks in shades of pink and gray. They tethered their horses in a hidden copse of trees and continued on foot. The map led them up a treacherous, barely there trail, a path that only a man who knew the mountains intimately could follow. "My father and I, we charted this whole range," James said, his one good arm gesturing to the peaks around them. "We were prospectors before we were ranchers. We knew these mountains like the backs of our hands." As they climbed higher, the sound reached them, a faint, rhythmic clink, clink, clink echoing through the cold, still air. "They're already here," Davies said grimly, pulling his pistol. They crept to the edge of a ridge and peered down. Below them was the entrance to the old northern mine. A handful of Crane's most loyal men were working frantically, setting charges of dynamite at the base of the rock face. Crane himself was there, pacing like a caged wolf, his face a mask of furious impatience. "He's not even trying to be subtle," Elias whispered. "He's just going to blow his way in." "We can't take them head on," Davies said. "There are too many of them, and they're armed." Clara was studying the map, her brow furrowed in concentration. Then she looked at the sun, which was just beginning to climb into the sky. "We don't have to," she said suddenly. "The clue. Where the shadow falls at noon. We're looking at the wrong place." She pointed to a different spot on the map, a jagged peak that towered over the valley. "The entrance isn't in the mine. It's up there. We've been following the path to the treasure, but the door is somewhere else." James's eyes widened as he understood. "The girl's right. It's a misdirection. We always loved our little puzzles, James and I." Their new path was even more dangerous, a narrow ledge that hugged the side of the mountain. One misstep would mean a fatal plunge to the valley floor. But they moved with a desperate speed, the sounds of Crane's men growing fainter behind them. They reached the spot marked on the map just as the sun was reaching its zenith. It was a flat, open rock face, seemingly impenetrable. "Now we wait," Clara said, her eyes fixed on the sun. As the clock ticked towards noon, the magic began to happen. A single, brilliant beam of sunlight pierced the clouds and struck the rock face. It hit a vein of what looked like white crystal, and the light was refracted, creating a dazzling, shimmering pattern on the stone. And in the center of the pattern, a thin, dark line appeared. An outline. A hidden door. "My God," Davies breathed. "It's real." Elias and James put their shoulders to the rock, and with a low groan, a massive slab of stone swung inwards, revealing a dark, narrow opening. The air that wafted out was cold and ancient, smelling of damp earth and long-forgotten secrets. They lit a lantern and stepped inside. The passage sloped downwards, into the heart of the mountain. After a few hundred feet, it opened into a small, dry cavern, and in the center of the cavern, on a natural stone pedestal, sat a heavy, leather-bound ledger. They had found it. Clara reached for it with a trembling hand. She opened the cover. The pages were filled with her father's neat, precise handwriting and James's blockier script. Dates, names, amounts. A detailed, damning account of the Crane family's reign of terror. But as she flipped through the pages, her blood ran cold. The last few entries were different. They weren't about financial crimes. They were about something else, something far more personal and far more devastating. "Elias," she whispered, her voice choked. "There's something you need to see." She turned the book towards him, pointing to the final entry, written in his father's hand. The entry was dated the day before he had disappeared. "Crane knows about the boy. Not my son, Sutton's son. We switched them at birth. My wife, she passed in childbirth, and Sutton's wife, she was too weak to survive another. We made a pact. My boy, with his weak lungs, would have a better chance in the city with Sutton's family connections. And Sutton's boy, strong and healthy, he would be raised here, on the land, a rancher, a boon. It was a desperate plan to save them both, but now Crane knows. He thinks he can use the boy against me, the boy he thinks is my heir. I have to disappear. I have to let my own son think I am a ghost, and let the other boy believe he is my son. It is the only way to protect them both, the only way to protect Elias." The lantern light flickered on Elias's face. He was staring at the page, his face completely white, his expression one of utter soul-shattering disbelief. He wasn't a Boone. He was a Sutton. He was Clara's brother. The revelation was a bomb that detonated in the silent cavern, destroying everything he thought he knew about himself. His name, his heritage, his entire identity. It was all a lie, a noble lie, a lie designed to save his life, but a lie nonetheless. He looked at Clara, and she saw the profound agony in his eyes. The love he felt for her, the kiss they had shared, the future he had just begun to dream of. It was all built on a foundation of impossible, catastrophic untruth. "No," he whispered, "it can't be." But the truth was there, in his father's own hand. Just then, the sound of footsteps echoed from the passage behind them. They had been followed. Jeremiah Crane stood at the entrance to the cavern, a triumphant, demonic smile on his face. He held a pistol in his hand. "Touching," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "A family reunion. I was beginning to wonder how to break the news to you both." He had known. He had known the secret all along. "It's over, Crane," Davies said, drawing his own weapon. "Is it?" Crane laughed. "I don't think so. That ledger is worthless without a witness, and in a moment, there won't be any." He raised the pistol, but he wasn't aiming at Davies or at James. He was aiming at Clara. "Give me the ledger or your sister dies," he snarled at Elias. Time seemed to slow down. Elias was frozen, trapped in an impossible choice. His entire world had been ripped apart, and now he was being forced to choose between the woman he loved and the justice his family had died for. But in that moment of pure crisis, something inside him shifted. The confusion, the pain, it all burned away, leaving behind a single, cold, hard certainty. He might not be a Boone by blood, but he was his father's son in every way that mattered, and he would not let this monster win. He took a step forward, placing himself between Crane and Clara. "You'll have to kill me first," he said, his voice a low, deadly growl. "With pleasure," Crane said, and his finger tightened on the trigger. A gunshot exploded in the confined space of the cavern, but it wasn't Elias who fell. It was Crane. He looked down in surprise at the red stain spreading across his chest. He staggered backwards, his eyes wide with disbelief, and then crumpled to the floor. Standing in the passageway behind him, his face grim, his one good arm holding a smoking pistol, was James Boone. "That," he said, his voice shaking with emotion, "was for my son, and for yours." The silence that followed was absolute. The long, bloody feud was finally over. The truth was out. Justice had been served. But for Elias and Clara, the world had been irrevocably, painfully broken. They walked out of the cavern, and into the blinding sunlight, the ledger in Clara's hand. They were no longer two lovers who had found each other against all odds. They were siblings, bound by a terrible, tragic secret. Elias looked at Clara, his heart a raw, open wound. He loved her. God, he loved her. But the love he felt was now a forbidden thing, a love that could never be. "Clara," he began, his voice choked. I know," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I know, Elias." There were no other words to say. Their shared future, the one they had fought so hard for, had been stolen from them by a secret that was meant to save them. The new wedding rings, crafted from the gold Elias had panned himself, lay in a small velvet box on Clara's dresser. They were simple, beautiful, and a symbol of a promise that could never be fulfilled. 6 months had passed. 6 months of a strange, quiet peace. With the evidence from the ledger, Marshal Davies and his men had dismantled the Crane Empire completely. The corruption that had plagued the territory for a generation was rooted out. The stolen land was returned. James Boone, his name finally cleared, had become a reluctant hero. He and Elias now ran the ranch together. Father and son, though not by blood, were bound by something stronger, a shared history of loss and a deep, unspoken love. They were healing, slowly, but the ghosts of the past were never far away. The town of Red Bluff had transformed. The whispers had stopped. The gossip had died. In its place was a quiet respect for the two people who had saved them all. Clara was no longer the plain widow. Elias was no longer the fearsome giant. They were heroes, but in the quiet moments, in the lonely hours of the night, the truth of their situation was a constant, aching pain. They lived in the same house, worked side by side, shared meals at the same table. They were family, but the love that had sparked so brightly between them was now banked, smothered under the heavy weight of what they knew. They were careful with each other, their touches brief and accidental, their words polite and measured. They were two people in love, forced to pretend they were only brother and sister. One evening, as the sun set over the valley, painting the sky in heartbreaking shades of purple and orange, Clara found Elias on the porch. He was staring out at the land, his face a mask of quiet sorrow. "It's a beautiful evening," she said softly, coming to stand beside him. "Yes," he said. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. It was too painful. "Elias," she began, her voice trembling, "we can't go on like this. This silence. It's killing us." "What do you want me to say, Clara?" he asked, his voice raw. "That I don't love you? That I don't lie awake every night thinking about you? About what we could have had? I can't. It would be a lie." "I love you too," she whispered, and the confession was both a relief and a torment. "But we are what we are." "And what is that?" he asked bitterly. "Brother and sister? How can I be your brother when my heart feels like this?" Just then, James came out onto the porch. He looked at their two miserable faces and the weight of his own choices, the consequences of the lie he had told so many years ago, seemed to settle on his shoulders. "There's one more secret," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "One more piece of the story I never told anyone, not even the marshals." Clara and Elias turned to look at him, their expressions wary. They didn't think they could bear any more revelations. "Your fathers. They were more than just partners," James said, his eyes distant with memory. "They were idealists. They believed in building a new kind of community here, one based on fairness and equality. The ledger, it wasn't just about the Crane family's crimes." He took a deep breath. It was also a legal document, a charter. They were creating a new township, with its own laws, laws that were ahead of their time, and one of those laws, it was about the definition of family. He pulled a folded, yellowed piece of paper from his pocket. It was a page that had been carefully removed from the ledger. "They believed that family wasn't just about blood," James said, his voice thick with emotion as he handed the paper to Clara. "They believed it was about choice, about commitment, about love. Clara's hands trembled as she read the words written in her father's hand. In this community, let it be known that the bonds of matrimony shall not be restricted by accidents of birth or by prior filial relations not of a direct, lineal descent. A family, forged in shared hardship and dedicated love, shall be considered a sacred and binding union, superseding all other claims. Clara looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief. It was a loophole, a deliberate, forward-thinking clause, written by two men who believed love was stronger than blood. "What does this mean?" she breathed. "It means," James said, a slow, watery smile spreading across his face, "that your fathers, in their wisdom, gave you a way out. They wrote their own laws, and under the laws of the community they intended to build on this very land. You are not bound as brother and sister." The words hung in the air, a stunning, unbelievable gift. A pardon. Elias looked at Clara, his heart hammering in his chest. Hope, a feeling he had thought was lost to him forever, began to bloom, fragile and brilliant. "Clara?" he whispered, her name a prayer. She looked at him, and for the first time in 6 agonizing months, she let herself truly see him, not as her brother, but as the man she loved, the man who had fought for her, protected her, and loved her even when he thought it was impossible. A slow smile spread across her face, a smile that lit up her entire being. "Well," she said, her voice teasing, but her eyes shining with tears of joy, "it seems to me, Mr. Sutton, that we have a wedding to plan." He closed the distance between them in a single stride and swept her into his arms. And this time, the kiss wasn't hesitant or forbidden. It was a celebration, a kiss of homecoming, a promise of a future that had been lost, and then, miraculously, found again. The wedding was held in the meadow, under the wide open sky. The whole valley came to celebrate the union of the two people who had become their heart. James Boone stood as his son's best man, his face a portrait of peace and redemption. As Elias slid the simple gold band onto Clara's finger, he leaned in and whispered, for her ears only. "Mrs. Boone," he said, his voice thick with love. "I like the sound of that." "I do too," she replied, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. They had been through the fire, through betrayal and loss and heartbreak. They had discovered that family was more than blood, that love was a choice you make every day, and that sometimes the most beautiful stories are the ones that are almost broken beyond repair. They had found their way home, not just to the land their fathers had died to protect, but to each other. If this story of love, loss, and redemption touched your heart, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We bring you tales that dig deep into the human spirit every single week, and you won't want to miss what we have in store for you next. Thanks for listening.